I'm going to read a little bit more from this book called Bilingual Life and Reality by Francois Grosjean. And last time I read something which stood out to me personally, so I wanted to read that. But I think it raised a couple of things through the comments in YouTube. And I wanted to backtrack a little and read the rest of this chapter, the beginning of it, because I think it contains some more details that I think are probably relevant to this topic. So let's begin. Personality, thinking, and dreaming, and emotions in bilinguals. In chapter 3, I mentioned how bilinguals deal with well-learned mental processes such as counting, praying, remembering phone numbers, and so on. In this chapter, we'll examine some other topics that often come up regarding bilinguals. Do they change personality when they change language? What language do they think in or dream in? And how do they express their emotions? Such questions are fascinating, as are the answers. The personality of bilinguals. In a news item on 24 June 2008 entitled "Switching Languages Can Also Switch Personality," study, Reuters reported on research that supposedly showed that people who are bicultural and speak two languages may unconsciously change their personality when they switch languages. With this wire, the International Press Agency was simply perpetuating a long-standing misapprehension. Myth: bilinguals have double or split personalities. What evidence is there for this position? Before describing the study mentioned by Reuters, let's look at what some individual bilinguals have said about this. A French-English bilingual once wrote to me, "I know that I am more aggressive, more caustic when I speak French. I am also more rigid and more narrow-minded in defending my assertions." A Greek-English bilingual noted, "In English, my speech is very polite, with a relaxed tone, always saying please and excuse me. When I speak Greek, I start talking more rapidly, with a tone of anxiety and in a kind of rude way, without using any English speech characteristics." Finally, a Russian-English bilingual wrote, "I find when I'm speaking Russian, I feel like a much more gentle, softer person. In English, I feel more harsh, businesslike." Thus, both the French-English and the Greek-English bilinguals feel they are more aggressive and more tense in French or Greek, respectively, than they are in English. And the Russian-English bilingual is more gentle in Russian. The impressions shared by these bilinguals and others have been alluded to in the literature. Robert Di Pietro, a linguist who was himself an English-Italian bilingual, once observed that in an Italian-American-owned store in Washington, D.C., the butcher's style was different when he changed languages. In English, he was rather formal, whereas in Italian, he would joke and sometimes even engage in mild flirtations with young women. And Charles Gallagher, an expert on North Africa, reported that when Arab-French bilinguals enjoyed themselves with French friends, their whole character was quite distinct from that expressed in Arabic. Psychologist Susan Irvin did some very interesting work at the beginning of her career on this precise question. In one study, she showed thematic apperception test cards, TAT cards, showing pictures that have ambiguous content to French-English bilinguals who had lived in the United States for an average of 12 years. She tested them in 2 sessions, one for each language, that were conducted 6 weeks apart, and she found significant effects of language on 3 variables: verbal aggression toward peers, withdrawal autonomy, and achievement. For example, for the same card, one bilingual said in the French language session, "I think he," the husband, "wants to leave her because he's found another woman he loves more. I don't know whose fault it is, but they certainly seem angry. And in the English language session, she said, "He's decided to get a good education. He keeps on working and going to college at night some of the time. He'll get a better job, and they will be much happier. His wife will have helped him along." Irvin observed that in French, the picture elicited themes such as aggression and striving for autonomy, whereas in English, the wife is seen as supporting her husband. In another study, Irvin asked Japanese American women to complete the sentences she gave them in both Japanese and in English. She found that they proposed very different endings, depending on the language used. For example, for the sentence beginning, "When my wishes conflict with my family," one participant's Japanese ending was, "It is a time of great unhappiness," whereas the English ending was, "I do what I want." For the sentence beginning, "Real friends should," the Japanese ending was, "Help each other," and the English ending was, "Be very frank." Some 40 years later, David Luna and his colleagues conducted the study that was described by the Reuters newswire. Although very similar to the Irvin studies, the earlier work was not mentioned, which is unfortunate, as Irvin had given a reasonable explanation for the results she had obtained. In Luna's research, Hispanic American bilingual women, students, were asked to perform several tasks. In one study, they had to interpret target advertisements, first in one language and then 6 months later in another. The ads contained pictures of women, and they were asked questions like, "What is the woman in the ad doing? How does she feel?" and so on. Luna and his colleagues found that in the Spanish sessions, informants perceived women in the ads as more self-sufficient, strong, intelligent, industrious, ambitious, as well as extroverted. In the English sessions, however, they voiced a more traditional, other-dependent, and family-oriented view of the women. In a second study, the subjects were given a timed categorization task that showed that the associations between the category masculine and the category other-dependent on the one hand, and the category feminine and the category self-sufficient on the other, was stronger in Spanish than in English, thereby giving converging evidence for the results of the first study. Does this mean, then, that bilinguals have two identities, as the title of the Luna paper, "One Individual, Two Identities," seems to indicate? Or that the Reuters statement in its wire, based on this research, is correct? Biculturals who speak two languages may unconsciously change their personality when they switch languages. Could it be that there is some truth to the Czech proverb, "Learn a new language and get a new soul"? One should note first that monocultural bilinguals are not concerned by any of this, even though they probably make up the vast majority of bilinguals in the world. Indeed, in many African, European, and Asian nations, people are bi- or multilingual while being members of just one major culture. But what about bicultural bilinguals? I proposed more than 25 years ago in my first book on bilingualism that what is seen as a change in personality is simply a shift in attitudes and behaviors corresponding to a shift in situation or context, independent of language. In essence, the bicultural bilingual subjects in these various studies were behaving biculturally, that is, adapting to the context they were in. See the previous chapter. In fact, Susan Irvin, in her very first study in 1964, stated something similar. It is possible that a shift in language is associated with a shift in social roles and emotional attitudes. Since each language is learned and usually employed with different persons and in a different context, the use of each language may come to be associated with a shift in a large array of behavior. As we saw in the earlier discussion of the functions of languages, bilinguals use their languages for different purposes, in different domains of life, with different people. Different aspects of life often require different languages. Contexts and domains trigger different attitudes, impressions, and behaviors, and what is seen as a personality change due to language shift may have nothing to do with the language itself. In fact, when I questioned some other bilinguals, they put their finger right on the explanation. A French, Flemish, English trilingual stated, "I don't really know if my personality changes when I change language. The main reason for this uncertainty is that I use the two languages in different situations, and therefore I would act differently, even if it was in the same language." As this trilingual person clearly indicates, different situations make one behave differently, whether one is using one language or several languages. Just think of the way you speak with your best friend, and the behavior and personality you adopt with him or her, and think of how this changes in the most formal interactions you have, such as with a school head, religious authority, or employer. Another way of examining this is to observe biculturals who are monolingual. Although they have just one language, they probably behave exactly like biculturals who are bilingual, thereby demonstrating that it is not a switch in language that triggers behavioral and attitudinal changes. A final testimony comes from a Swiss, German, French, English trilingual. When talking English, French, or German to my sister, my personality does not change. However, depending on where we are, both our behaviors may adapt to certain situations we find ourselves in. In other words, it is the environment and the interlocutors together that cause bicultural bilinguals to change attitudes, feelings, and behaviors, along with language, and not their language as such. All this makes much less spectacular news, unworthy of a Reuters news story, but probably much closer to the truth. Thinking and dreaming in bilinguals. One question bilinguals are often asked: what language do they think in? I asked the same question in a small survey I conducted with bilinguals and trilinguals, and the answer was both languages, 70%. But before we try to understand this result, I should stress that thinking can often be independent of language. When people are walking down the street, riding a bus, or jogging in the woods, their thoughts may not be in a particular language, whether they are monolingual or bilingual. Philosophers and psychologists have long acknowledged that thought can be a visual, spatial, or involve non-linguistic concepts. Some scholars, such as Steven Pinker and Jerry Fodor, propose that we have a language of thought. It has also been called mentalese, that is pre-linguistic. That is, it takes place before the representations we are thinking about are turned into French, English, or Spanish, for example. According to Pinker and Fodor, but there are opponents of this view, it is only at a later stage in our planning to speak or subvocalizing that individual languages actually intervene. It is then that we are sometimes conscious of the language that we have activated. The both languages answer cited above is not surprising, since the bilinguals I asked probably took into account their internal monologues or inner speech when they answered. And since speech, in this case non-verbalized speech, is normally used in different situations, with different people and for different purposes, see the discussion of the complementarity principle, their answer makes a lot of sense. Thus, were I to think about something I want to say in this book, after the language of thought or mentalese stage, it would be in English, because I am writing in that language. Were I to think about a shopping list, it would be in French, as I live in a French-speaking region. Were I to think about what a friend told me the other day, it would be in the language that the friend used when we spoke. As linguist Anita Pavlenko wrote to me, in that way, context-specific activation affects language selection for inner speech. Things are no different when one is dreaming. In the small survey I conducted, almost as many bilinguals and trilinguals, 64%, said that they dreamed in one or the other language, depending on the dream. When they dreamed with language, of course. Once again, the complementarity principle is at work here. Depending on the situation and the person we are dreaming about, we will use the one language, the other, or both. For example, a French-English bilingual in the United States once told me that he had dreamed about a little village in the French-speaking part of Switzerland that he knew well, but to which he had not returned for several years. In his dream, he met an inhabitant of the village, and he spoke French to him. One interesting aspect of dreams in bilinguals is that some people have reported speaking a language fluently in a dream, when they are not actually fluent in that language. The linguist Veraboj Vildemek reported that a multilingual who spoke some Russian dreamed that he was speaking fluent Russian. But when he woke up, he realized that it had been, in fact, a mixture of Czech and Slovak, with a bit of Russian, and not fluent Russian after all. Vildemek added that other bilinguals reported producing interferences during their dreams, that is, deviations in a language due to another language, even though they rarely made any when awake. It is true that some bilinguals are extremely careful to keep interferences out of their everyday speech, whereas when they are sleeping, their brain can relax and let the other language seep in. And the rest of the chapter is what I read a couple of videos ago. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting. Again, this is from a book by Francois Grosjean called Bilingual Life and Reality. Excellent book, and I still haven't finished it. I'm still getting through. I'm about halfway. Anyway, I'll catch you guys later on. Bye for now.